The cold didn't come in waves. It lingered. It wasn't a passing wind. It was a presence that settled between her skin and fabric, as if it had found a permanent place there. When she breathed, the air entered harsh, dry, and seemed to scratch from within before exiting again, weaker. Her hands no longer knew what it was to be warm. Her fingers stiffened around nothing, and even when they tried to move, it was like moving something that no longer belonged to her body. She sat with her back against a wall that didn't get hot. The stone kept the cold out and slowly returned it, as if war had learned to be patient. The ground was a hard certainty under the weight of her hips, and there was a weariness that wasn't just from the day. It was an accumulated, old weariness, made of nights that didn't rest and mornings that didn't begin again. Her body still got up because it had to, but inside she had already given up trying to understand why. There, waiting tasted like hunger. Something slow, constant, that made no noise. It wasn't the sharp pain that made someone scream. It was a silent pressure, the kind of thing that changes how a person looks at the space ahead. She learned to tell time by sounds, not by clocks. A step in the hallway, metal hitting metal, a piece of wood creaking. Everything served to measure how much time was left, until the next moment when something bad could happen. And the hardest part was this, not knowing when. She was afraid of what was to come, but she was also afraid of what wasn't. When nothing happened, her mind would start working on its own, fabricating images to fill the void. It wasn't a choice. It was instinct trying to prepare itself, trying to guess. On some days, the silence seemed like a kind of gaze, as if the whole place was attentive to the slightest movement, waiting for a mistake, a weakness, one more sound. She remembered her own body before all of this, not as a beautiful memory, but as a comparison. Before, her body was just a body. Now it was a watched object, a weight to be carried, something that could be summoned and moved at any time. She felt shame for no clear reason. Shame at taking up space, shame at breathing too loudly, shame at existing in a place where existing seemed like a mistake. Around them, other women were nearby, but there was no real conversation. Speaking was a risk. A word could become a reason. A question could become a challenge. They had learned to keep their words inside their mouths, like someone saving food. When someone whispered, it was quick, almost soundless, and soon the air returned to a heavy silence. It was a silence made of caution, a trained silence. The uniform outside, the presence that sometimes crossed the hallway, that sometimes stopped before the door, was not seen as a person. It was seen as a warning. The color, the cut, the glint of a button, everything meant the same thing. Attention. Stay small. Don't call. Don't ask. Don't exist more than necessary. They had learned this without anyone explaining it. Learned it the way you learn when there is no alternative. No one there needed an explicit threat to obey. The body obeyed on its own. Her spine would arch. Her gaze would lower. Her shoulders would stiffen. She could see her own heart racing even before she recognized a sound. Sometimes, the mere rhythm of firmer steps was enough to make her stomach clench. It was as if her skin had a memory and reacted on its own. There were times when she thought about complaining. Not loudly, not angrily, just with a minimal request, a simple need. Water, a blanket, one more minute. But the idea died before it could fully take shape, crushed by another certainty. Complaining would only make things worse. Even when no one had said it in words, the place said it. The walls said it. The corridor said it. The way the guards looked, or didn't look, said it. So she did what everyone else did. She waited. She breathed shallowly. She recounted what she could recount: the cold, the hunger, the pain in her joints, the heaviness in her eyes, and she waited. Nothing happened, and that was the worst part. Because when nothing happens, the body doesn't relax. It stays on high alert for hours, days, weeks. Alertness becomes routine. Fear becomes routine. And routine, little by little, begins to seem like the only reliable thing in that broken world. That day, when the door opened, it wasn't a bang. It was a firm, mechanical movement, as if someone were opening a storage room door. The hallway light entered first, cutting across the floor with a pale streak. Then came the voice. A few words, short, dry, spoken without explanation. There was no shouting, no lengthy warning, just the order, as if what was about to happen was already obvious to everyone. Her body reacted before her mind could process it. She stood up with a speed that hurt. Her weak legs accepted the command as if they still knew what discipline was. Her chest tightened, and her throat went dry. She didn't know the reason for that order, and precisely because of that, fear grew in a deep, automatic, ancient place. Fear of punishment even without any gesture. Fear as a reflex. Fear as a native tongue. She exchanged a quick glance with the woman beside her. There was no question in that look, only recognition. The same wordless thought. What is now? What is this time? What will it cost today? And nobody said anything. They had just started walking, trying to keep a steady pace, trying not to seem too slow, trying not to draw attention to themselves with the way they walked. The corridor seemed colder than the cell. Or perhaps it was just their bodies realizing that outside of there, things could get worse. The door closed behind them with a simple sound. No drama, a routine sound. And the waiting, once again, began to grow inside, as if it would never end. Fear that has become routine. At first, each order seemed unique. Each call made the body tremble as if it were the first time. Then, something changed. Not for the better, just more silent. The fear ceased to be a surprise and became deep-seated. It settled in the chest, behind the eyes, in the muscles of the legs. It no longer needed a clear reason. It woke up with the body and carried on until the end of the day without asking permission. Obedience ceased to be a decision. It became an automatic movement. When someone spoke, the body responded before thought. Stand up, walk, stop, turn. Everything happened with a sad precision, as if that body had been reprogrammed not to make mistakes. Making mistakes was costly, and no one needed to explain that. It was enough to look at the floor, at the walls, at the faces that had already learned not to ask. The uniform continued to move through the corridors like a constant signal. It didn't matter who was inside. The person vanished. What remained was the function of watching, commanding, controlling. She never allowed herself to look for too long. A prolonged gaze could be interpreted as a challenge, so her eyes learned to descend, to fix on neutral points. The cracked ground, someone's boot, the dark line between two stones. There was a shame that didn't stem from guilt, but from exposure. Shame at being seen that way, at being counted, observed, moved. Her body always seemed wrong, too thin, too dirty, too slow. Even in silence, she felt as if she were failing at something no one had properly explained. The surveillance didn't need words to work. It entered her mind and settled there. Over time, complaining became a distant, almost childish idea, as if asking for something meant forgetting the invisible rules of that place. The rules said not to draw attention, not to occupy more space than strictly necessary, not to show pain. Pain existed, but it had to remain contained, hidden on the face, controlled in gestures. Showing too much could be interpreted as weakness, or worse, as an affront. She observed the other women and recognized the same weariness in them. Stooped shoulders, short steps, hands always close to their bodies. Sometimes, someone would take a second longer to obey, and that second seemed endless. The air grew heavy. The silence became denser. Everyone felt it. Everyone learned. The lesson spread without needing to be spoken. The routine was made up of small humiliations that didn't attract attention when viewed from the outside, but which, together, corroded from within. Waiting, standing, waiting, sitting, waiting without knowing for how long, waiting for someone who might not even come. Time didn't move forward there. It dragged on. Each day seemed like an imperfect repetition of the previous one, with the same cold, the same hunger, the same contained fear. She began to notice that her body was always tense, even when nothing was happening. Her muscles wouldn't relax. Sleep came lightly, broken, insufficient. When she closed her eyes, she didn't rest. She only drifted off for a few minutes until some sound, real or imagined, pulled her back. Fear had learned to live inside her, as if it were part of her. At times, she wondered when was the last time she had felt like a whole person. Not a prisoner, not a number, not a body under control, just a person. The question would arise quickly and disappear just as easily, swallowed up by the need to continue. Overthinking could weaken her, and weakening there was dangerous. So she went on, one day after another, one command after another, without openly resisting, without fully accepting, simply existing in that narrow space between what remained of herself and what the place demanded she be. Fear no longer screamed. He breathed along with her, and that was what made it all even harder to bear. A simple order that carried a threat. The words came short, without beating around the bush, as if there were nothing to explain. A dry sentence, spoken in the same tone used every day. There was no emotion in it, no hurry, no anger. Precisely for that reason, the effect was immediate. The body understood before the mind could organize any thought. The shoulders tensed, the breathing shortened. Something inside prepared for the impact, even without knowing where it would come from. She only realized her fists were clenched after a few seconds. She didn't remember clenching them. The tension simply appeared, automatically, like an ancient reflex. The fear there didn't need a direct threat. It already knew the way. The mere existence of order was enough for everything inside her to go into a defensive position. Nobody asked anything. Asking questions had never been part of that logic. Questions had been left behind long ago, along with other things that no longer seemed possible. Now there was only the immediate, almost mechanical, compliance with everything that was said. Even when the order seemed too simple to justify so much apprehension, the apprehension still came. She tried to observe the face of the person speaking, searching for any sign, any detail that would indicate what was to come. She found nothing. The face was neutral. The eyes revealed no intention. This only increased the feeling of threat. When there were no clues, imagination took over, filling in the gaps. And imagination there was never kind. Their steps began to move almost in sync, not because anyone had planned it, but because everyone had learned the same rhythm. Walking too slowly could attract attention. Too fast, too. There was a safe middle ground, built from past mistakes. Mistakes seen, mistakes that had cost others dearly. She felt the uneven ground beneath her feet, each stone marking the thin sole of her shoe. Her body ached in places she could no longer name. Still, she continued, not out of force, but out of habit. The habit of continuing, even when everything inside begged for a pause. The habit of not stopping to feel too much. Their eyes met again, quick, almost invisible. There was no courage in them, nor consolation. There was calculation, an attempt to read, a silent effort to guess if this would end soon, or if it was just the beginning of something worse. No one spoke, but everyone was thinking in the same direction. The fear of punishment didn't need any gesture to manifest itself. It came beforehand. It came simply with the possibility. Her body remembered situations where a simple order had been followed by something disproportionate. It remembered what came after, what couldn't be undone. These memories didn't appear as clear images, but as fleeting sensations. Tightness in her stomach, weight on her shoulders, a coldness different from that of the surrounding environment. She realized she was holding her breath as she walked. She released the air slowly, carefully, as if even that could be observed. There, even breathing seemed like something that needed to be controlled. Everything needed to be measured. Everything needed to fit within invisible limits. The order kept echoing in my head, too simple to justify so much fear. But fear didn't respond to logic. It responded to experience. And experience had taught me that nothing there was truly simple. As they moved forward, she felt time stretching out again. Each step seemed to push the next, as if her body wanted to delay the inevitable. Silence accompanied the group, thick and attentive. There was no sound beyond the subdued murmur of their movements, and in that space between the order received and what had not yet happened, the waiting began to weigh heavily once more. A tense weight, full of bad possibilities, sustained only by the habit of obeying and the vague hope that perhaps this time the worst would not come. Still, nobody really believed it. The waiting's more exhausting than the punishment. After the order, nothing came. No continuation, no explanation. Only time opening up before them like an empty space that needed to be crossed without knowing where it ended. They were placed there and remained, standing, then sitting, then standing again. The body lost the notion of correct posture because none seemed to last long enough to become a resting place. Time didn't move as before. It stretched out, heavy, as if each minute had been made to last longer than it should. There was no clock, no clear marker. Her body tried to measure the passage of time by the tiredness in her legs, by the pain that began subtly and then spread, by the dryness in her mouth. That's what she knew she was still experiencing. Nothing was happening, and the mind, unoccupied, began to work against itself. It created scenarios, recalled similar situations, pieced together fragments of past experiences, and assembled possibilities. None of them were good. It was a way of preparing itself, of not being caught off guard. Even so, each thought seemed to consume a little more of the little energy that remained. The silence wasn't the absence of sound. It was a constant presence, a silence that pressed down, that made every movement seem bigger than it was. Coughing seemed risky. Changing position seemed to draw attention. Even the way one breathed needed to be controlled. The silence functioned as a kind of invisible control, more effective than shouting. It kept everyone alert, tense, waiting. She felt her dignity slowly eroding, not in one big moment, but through repetition. Repetition of waiting. Repetition of not knowing. Repetition of remaining motionless while her body begged for relief. There was no explicit humiliation in that instant. There was something more subtle, more exhausting. The feeling that her time didn't matter, that it could be spent there without explanation. Some women subtly shifted their weight from one foot to the other. Others kept their eyes fixed on some random point, as if staring too long could trigger something. No one spoke. Speaking would be useless there. What was there to say? That they were tired, that it hurt. That was already known, or worse, it was no longer relevant. She noticed her body beginning to tremble slightly, not just from the cold, but from exertion. Standing still required more effort than walking. Her muscles complained silently, as if they had learned that protesting aloud was pointless. The pain became constant, almost stable, and that was frightening. When pain stops demanding attention, it's because it has already become part of the scenery. At some point, she lost all sense of how much time had passed. It could have been minutes. It could have been hours. Her body could no longer distinguish clearly. What mattered was the continuation of the waiting, a waiting without a clear objective, without a visible end. Only the certainty that it was not yet over. Punishment, when it came, at least had form. It had a beginning and an end. This didn't. This was diffuse, a slow erosion that corroded from within without leaving obvious marks. A type of punishment that didn't need to be acknowledged as such. For a brief moment, she thought that perhaps that was all, that perhaps nothing else would happen. The idea brought no relief. It brought exhaustion, because even if that was all, it still seemed too much for a body that had already been pushed beyond its limits for a long time. The silence continued. Time continued. And as she waited, she felt something slowly emptying out inside her. Not the will to live. Something simpler, the expectation that things would make sense. A gesture that was out of place during wartime. When something finally happened, it wasn't the way she expected. There was no shouting. There was no abruptness. There was a pause, too short to be announced, too long to go unnoticed. A strange, misplaced interval, as if someone had forgotten for a second the role they were supposed to play. She noticed it first in the rhythm. The movement, which had always been quick, almost automatic, slowed down. A step was taken with less haste. A command didn't come immediately. Her body, accustomed to reacting, was suspended, unsure whether to advance or retreat. The suspension brought more tension than relief. Pauses there were never neutral. Then came the gesture. Simple, restrained, almost invisible to anyone not expecting the worst. An object placed on the ground a little closer. A minimal adjustment of position. Something that, in another context, would mean nothing. But there, in that place where everything was measured by risk, it stood out. It took her a while to understand what she was seeing. Her mind resisted. It searched for the mistake. It awaited the correction. Such a gesture didn't fit with what she had learned up to that point. It didn't fit with war. It didn't fit with space. It didn't fit with the logic that governed her days. The confusion was immediate and profound. Her body didn't relax. On the contrary, it stiffened even more. Accepting this seemed dangerous, as if trusting in that small act of care could open the door to a greater fall later. She had learned that kindness, when it appeared suddenly, almost always came with something hidden. A price, a condition, a worse outcome. She looked around, trying to confirm if the others had seen the same thing. Some faces were tense. Others seemed blank. No one moved to take anything. No one thanked her. There was no room for that. That gesture came without instructions, and anything left unexplained carried a threat. The silence had changed in quality. It was still heavy, but now there was a crack in it, a new discomfort. It was no longer just waiting for punishment. It was an attempt to understand a deviation. Something that deviated from the norm demanded more attention than predictable cruelty. Cruelty at least obeyed a known logic. She felt an inner resistance rising, almost physical. Part of her wanted to retreat, pretend nothing had happened, maintain a safe distance from the shattered expectation. Another part, smaller and weary, felt something different. Not hope, something more fragile, a confused recognition that for a moment the script had failed. The care was minimal. It didn't alleviate the cold. It didn't alleviate the hunger. It didn't change the situation. Even so, it weighed heavily. It weighed heavily because it forced the body to deal with something it wasn't prepared for. After so much denial, receiving any form of protection, however small, required an enormous effort. She realized she was holding her breath again. She exhaled slowly, unsure if it was allowed. Everything in her was on alert for a possible correction, a sign that the gesture would be taken away, punished, denied immediately. But nothing happened. The gesture remained there, quiet, without explanation, without immediate continuation. And in that strange instant, she understood that the waiting had changed form once again. It was no longer just the fear of what was to come. It was also the difficulty of accepting that, even in that scenario, something unexpected could happen. This brought no comfort. It brought disorientation. When obedience ceased to be automatic, it wasn't a clear decision. There wasn't an exact moment when she thought about stopping. What happened was simpler and more dangerous. Something inside her reached its limit before courage had time to form. Her body, which had always responded on its own, took a second longer, an almost imperceptible delay. But enough for her to feel it. She first noticed it in the weight of her legs. They still held her up, but they no longer obeyed with the same ease. The command came, and her body hesitated, not out of conscious rebellion, out of exhaustion, out of excess, as if the muscles had stored every order received up to that point, and suddenly had nowhere left to give another. Her breathing became irregular, not from immediate physical exertion, but from accumulated tension. Her chest felt too full, as if air couldn't find a place. She tried to adjust, to straighten her body, to return to automatic mode. She couldn't. Something had shifted inside. The risk of reacting presented itself without warning. Not as a scream, not as a sudden gesture. As a dull feeling that continuing, as she was also coming at too high a cost. She had learned to obey in order to survive. But at that moment, obeying seemed to mean disappearing a little further. She felt someone's gaze land on her. She didn't know where it came from. Maybe it was real. Maybe it was just fear doing what it always did. Her body responded with an immediate stiffening. Shoulders tense, chin clenched. The old posture tried to assert itself. Still, something was different. A boundary had been reached, even if no one else could see it. The idea of reacting wasn't clear. It had no form, no plan. It was simply the realization that if anything more were demanded at that pace, her body wouldn't keep up. Not by choice, by failure, by collapse. And failing there was dangerous in a way she knew all too well. For a brief moment, she thought that perhaps it would be better to give in completely, to let her body fall, to accept the end of that constant effort. The idea passed quickly, rejected by the same instinct that had kept her standing for so long. The instinct to continue, even without knowing how. All around her, everything seemed the same space, the same people, the same attentive silence. But inside her, something had shifted. It wasn't strength. It wasn't courage. It was the realization that remaining silent, continuing to obey without questioning, was also losing something that perhaps couldn't be recovered later. She adjusted her body weight, almost without moving. A minimal gesture, an internal repositioning. It didn't attract attention. It didn't provoke an immediate reaction. Yet for her, it was enormous. It was the silent acknowledgement that the automatic response had failed. The fear was still there. It hadn't gone away. But now it shared space with another feeling that was difficult to name. A kind of weary clarity. The the understanding that there were limits even to trained obedience, limits that the body knows before the mind accepts them. Nothing happened in that instant. No punishment, no new order. The outside world remained the same. But she knew that something had been crossed, a clear point of no return, even if invisible to everyone else. She remained standing, not because they were ordered to, but because at that moment it was still possible. What remained after that moment? So everything seemed to continue as before. The space didn't change. The orders remained brief. The silence remained attentive. To an outside observer, nothing would have happened there. No grand gesture, no visible break. Yet she felt that something had been displaced, like an object that moves from its place and never fits back in the same way. Her body remained tired. The cold persisted. The hunger hadn't gone away. None of that was resolved in that instant. But there was a subtle difference in how she waited now. The waiting was no longer completely empty. It had memory, and memory altered everything. The consequences didn't come in the form of immediate punishment. They came as an echo, a low, persistent echo that returned at unexpected moments. Sometimes when the silence stretched on too long. Sometimes when someone took too long to give the next order. The body remembered. It remembered the delay, the minimal gesture, the limit reached without warning. She realized that her way of observing had changed. Before, she observed only to protect herself. Now she also observed to recognize. Not people, not clear intentions, but possibilities. Small variations in rhythm, pauses that didn't exist before. None of this meant safety, but it meant that the world there wasn't made of a single layer. That moment didn't become hope. It didn't become a promise. It didn't become an explanation. It became a point of reference. Something against which the following days were compared, even without conscious intention. When the weight became unbearable, that was the instant that emerged, not as comfort, but as proof that not everything was completely predictable. The humanity that appeared there came without words. There was no excuse. There was no guarantee. It was preserved in the only way possible in that context, without announcement, without assured continuity. A brief, almost accidental fragment that required no interpretation. She never spoke about it. Not with the other women. I can't even put it into complete sentences. Some things, she understood, don't survive well when spoken aloud. They exist better in silence, just as they were born. Over time, the memory of that moment didn't become clearer. It became denser, less connected to the details and more to the sensation. The sensation of having seen something that shouldn't have been there, but was. Something that didn't erase the war, but also didn't allow itself to be erased by it. When it was all finally over, not that day, nor in that place, but much later, what remained was not the isolated fear, nor the specific pain. It was the reminder that, even in the most controlled space, there was a moment when control failed for a second, and that second one was enough to change the way we wait. The ending didn't come with final words, nor with clear conclusions. It came as almost everything else did, in silence, a silence different from that of the beginning, still heavy, still attentive, but full of presence. Some people move on, others stay a little longer. The stories continue here for those who choose to stay.